Hey guys, it's Emma Vigling with TYT Politics. Happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. It goes without saying that MLK is one of the greatest Americans of all time, and additionally, it should go without saying that his message of racial equality, acceptance, and peace resonates even more deeply in this current political and social climate with Trump in office. I think today is a great way to reflect not just on the poignancy of King's message and the power of his leadership, but the bravery and the power of his activism. We are currently in a period of activist influx in the face of our deeply unpopular president and deeply unpopular government on both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican. So his example of peaceful, powerful, and fiercely determined activism is as deeply felt as it ever was right now. Activism, when it is at its bravest, challenges the most powerful, and no one exemplified that bravery in activism more than Martin Luther King Jr. King didn't just challenge some abstract notion of racism with words like many on the right and many in the center like to allude to. No, his pacifist activism and his leadership was targeted at the conservative and moderate government institutions, even if they were portraying themselves as liberal, like LBJ, and open, that perpetuated injustice. It pissed people off, a lot of people. Even on the eve of his death on April 4th, 1968, he was more controversial and less popular than he had been at any time in his public career. In a Gallup poll conducted in 1963, 41% of respondents rated him favorably and 37% negatively. In 1967, just 32% gave him a favorable rating, whereas 63% viewed him negatively. King had received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, meaning that his popularity dipped after that. That's crazy. A part of this unpopularity was his stance against Vietnam, in addition to all of his other work. Speaking to 3,000 people in 1967, King said that the U.S. had no honorable intentions in Vietnam and that the government had been wrong about going to the war from the beginning. King argued that the U.S. was testing weapons on the Vietnamese people similar to how the Germans performed tests on Holocaust victims. Claiborne Carson, director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Institute at Stanford, says that his final unpopular move before his assassination was the Poor People's Campaign of 1968, where King called for a march on Washington to highlight the plight of Americans living in poverty. He was assassinated that year. Too often, MLK's image and message is invoked by those on the right and those in the center as someone who just preached about equality without any of the context of how he fought for that equality. He gave his life for that equality. His family home was repeatedly attacked for that equality because the fight for equality was so threatening to not just racism, some abstract term in a vacuum, but the institutions that perpetuated that racism. His fight for equality was so threatening that, yes, the FBI and the NSA spied on Martin Luther King Jr. Under a liberal president in LBJ, the government now displays him as some symbol of peace, but not too long ago, they viewed him as a threat. The head of FBI domestic intelligence called King the most dangerous, at least from the standpoint of national security. By the way, this was 2 days after his I Have a Dream speech. A few months after the first Edward Snowden revelation, the National Security Agency disclosed that it had itself wiretapped King in the late 1960s. Yet what happened to King is almost entirely absent from our current conversation. In NSA reform debates in the House of Representatives, King was mentioned only a handful of times, usually in passing, writes Alvaro M. Bedoya in Slate. It's a great editorial. You guys should read it. The FBI used information gleaned from taps and secret listening devices to smear King to the press and potential funders, and to engage in repugnant sexual blackmail. The editorial continues. There is a myth in this country that in a world where everyone is watched equally. It's as if an old and racist J. Edgar Hoover has been replaced by the race-blind magic of computers, mathematicians, and big data. The truth is more uncomfortable. Across our history and to this day, people of color have been the disproportionate victims of unjust surveillance. Hoover was no aberration. And while racism has played its ugly part, the justification for this monitoring was the same we hear today: national security. The FBI's violations against King were undeniably tinged by what historian David Garrow has called an organizational culture of like-minded white men. But as Garrow and others have shown, the FBI's initial wiretap requests and then Attorney General Robert Kennedy's approval of them were driven by a suspected tie between King and the Communist Party. It wasn't just King. Cesar Chavez, the labor and civil rights leader, was tracked for years as a result of vague, confidential tips about, quote, a communist background, as were many others. The list goes on and on. The FBI spied on and detained Japanese Americans during World War II. The NYPD and CIA monitored Muslim neighborhoods and mosques after 9/11. The Department of Homeland Security has reportedly been monitoring Black Lives Matter activists while white nationalists hold rallies in Charlottesville and they murder Heather Heyer, and white men like Dylann Roof shoot up churches. Yeah, that's who they're monitoring. The point being, King was seen as a genuine threat to the established order and was genuinely a controversial figure in his time, to conservatives and to liberals and to moderates. King himself recognized the destructive role of the moderate in political issues like this. In 1963, he wrote this: I must confess that over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizens counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. There is no more convenient season, right? There's never been a convenient season. There is no right way to protest, as the moderates would say about Kaepernick. Sure, I like the message, but why are you kneeling during the sacred anthem? This is all to say that King was not a moderate. He was not this bland fixture of equality and justice. He was an agitator. He was a revolutionary. He was a progressive. And don't let the moderates or the right tell you otherwise. He challenged the political establishment so much so that they spied on him vigorously, and he gave his life because of the boldness of his views. So like King, today we should learn not to combat racism and hatred as a thing in itself, in this vacuum. We must challenge the institutions that prop up that racism and hatred holistically. The institutions that do that also perpetuate income inequality, mass incarceration, bloodshed abroad, and all of the intersecting institutional factors that keep racism and xenophobia and hatred alive. Current-day moderates, also known sometimes as neoliberals, like to say that racism is the only reason that Trump won sometimes, and deem the agitators who push hard against the establishment as racist, like they did with Senator Bernie Sanders. With this, they do a complete disservice to the memory of Dr. King, of Reverend Martin Luther King, and what he stood for. King challenged the establishment as a whole, and did so while facing unbelievable opposition and pushback and unpopularity. So remember King's fight when challenging injustice. He went after the powerful, peacefully, but unabashedly. And he was unafraid to push for what was right despite immense institutional pushback. He is the bravest American in history. And he was a progressive and a revolutionary. And remember that, because to discount that does a disservice to his memory and everything that he and his movement stood for.